Good afternoon, everyone. Almost good evening. Appreciate everyone joining us. While we get situated, if you don't mind to put your name and where you're from in the chat, that lets us know who's our audience and try to tailor the discussion around that as much as we can. Just to get us going, again, you're here for the Ability Ground Rounds from the Center for Excellence in Disabilities. And I'm proud to say that this year's series, it goes until May, has national, regional, international speakers, international speaker tonight, as a matter of fact. And so what this is a chance for all of us to have a discussion, quick hour, 45 minutes, and share our experiences, learn about a topic maybe we know a lot about, maybe we don't know, and it's an introductory. But this is evidence-based research. We're learning from one of our peers. World is much smaller with Zoom, and it's absolutely fabulous. Closed captioning is available. And I just want to remind people certificates of attendance are also available. Just let me know that in the chat. And as always, Zoom etiquette, feel free. We love discussions. If you have a question, raise your hand, or as we go, if there's a nice pause, feel free to ask that. And of course, at the end, we'll give you time to ask questions, and we love the discussion. Otherwise, please watch the background noise so that everyone can enjoy the topic. And I think that's it. If you are willing to open your camera up, it's always nice to see faces, but we completely understand. If you're not, some people might even be having lunch this late in the day, and that is quite all right. We just appreciate you joining us. So with that, let me stop sharing, and I'll let you share your screens. And while we're doing that, let me introduce our speaker. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have various topics throughout the series. Dr. Is it Wiesel? Is that how you pronounce it? Wiesel. Okay. I did not ask you that. Dr. Wiesel is actually from the urban geography. He's an associate professor in urban geography in the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, and a faculty of science at the University of Melbourne, hence the later time. So again, very excited. And the title today, Making Mainstream Services More Inclusive for People with Intellectual Disabilities. So seeing some of our attendees, this will definitely fit many of our missions and passions across the state, but we're looking at an international perspective. So with that, let me turn it over to you. And I will watch the chat while you get started. How's that?
Thank you very much, Leslie. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for joining at a late time for you. It's 8 a.m. Here in Australia now, and I'm talking to you from a very lovely beach town just 2 hours from Melbourne, where I live. It's called Lorne. This is a city where I'm doing a little riding retreat, and really pleased to be talking to you today. So I work at the University of Melbourne. I'm a geographer, and but my primary interest is in disability, and particularly thinking about inclusive cities. So I'm an urban geographer. I'm interested in cities, and through the lens of disability, I try to think through questions about how we can make cities more inclusive. And another way to think about it is how, taking this kind of urban perspective, thinking from the perspective of an urbanist, what can we contribute to discussions and debate about inclusion for people with disabilities? And particularly my work is focused on intellectual disability. So I'll present to you today a talk which is based on a study that was funded by the Australian Research Council. It was a 3-year study. We've published quite a lot of kind of papers out of this work, and this paper that I'm presenting today is based on this particular paper that you see here from the Journal of Intellectual and Developmental Disability. It's called Inclusive Mainstream Services for People with Intellectual Disabilities, a Relational Approach. I might, if I have time, I'll speak a little bit about that idea of a relational approach, which is, I guess, informs the way me and my colleagues approach questions of inclusion. So I also want to acknowledge my colleagues who work with me on this project and also co-authors on the paper, Christine Bigby, Ellen Van Holstein, and Brendan Gleeson. So let's start. Where do we start? I always start my presentations with the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which is sort of the normative framework within which I work and many of my colleagues in disability studies do. And one of the rights that is recognized in the convention is the right for full and effective participation and inclusion in society. So every person and every person with disability has the right to participate and to be included in society. Now, inclusion is a big word. I'll present some of our findings from this study about how people with intellectual disabilities understand inclusion, what their interpretation of this word is. And inclusion speaks about things like social participation, economic participation, having jobs, political participation, cultural participation. So there are all kinds of different dimensions to this. I will focus on a small part of it, so it's not about all those different elements, but really just about access to services and what I will term mainstream services. And that's again in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Again, one of the elements of that right for inclusion is the right to access and participate on an equal basis with others in all publicly available services. I will refer to these here as mainstream services. So it's a distinction between what you might call specialist services that are just for people with disabilities, as opposed to mainstream services that, at least in theory, we know that's not really always the case, but at least in theory, they're designed for everyone, or at least for people of all abilities. So that's the theory, that's the aspiration of public services or mainstream services. But the research shows that people with intellectual disabilities are often excluded. They can't access mainstream services, or when they do access, they receive service that's relatively poor quality compared to others. We know that from the literature, and also the participants in our study, which I'll present to you today, described sometimes quite unsettling experiences of not getting access to a service, being discriminated when they want to enter a service, or coming to a service, but again, getting this sort of quite poor treatment. And I think much of my presentation will talk about what constitutes poor treatment versus what constitutes inclusive treatment or inclusive approach in mainstream services. So this really is the main question, the big research question, and the main question I'll address in this talk. What are the features of mainstream services that people with intellectual disabilities themselves perceive as inclusive or exclusionary in their experience? And the broader aim is not just to understand this and to take those features to develop a set of principles that can give us, I guess, the foundation of a framework, of a practice framework that can be applied in mainstream services and make them more inclusive. So there's a really applied, I guess, ambition here. And there's quite a lot of literature, and I'll review some of that now, which looks at those questions, questions of, just got a note that my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can all still hear me. Can you hear me, Leslie?
Yes, we can still hear you. It breaks up just a little bit, but we're still getting the gist.
Oh, okay. Hopefully it's going to be resolved very soon. So I guess what differentiates this study from other studies that we've reviewed is often people have looked at specific sectors like health services and how they make health services more inclusive, or say sports activities and how they make those more inclusive. So there's a lot of work done. What we would try to do here is to look across different sectors and see if there's some principles that can be applied across the variety of mainstream services. And then we can develop a framework that can be applied more broadly. So, we start a study, you start to review what others have written about it, and there is quite a bit of knowledge out there about what makes services inclusive. And again, this is my interpretation. It's not necessarily the exact way in which it's framed in some of those studies, but I think of it, and coming from a relational perspective, it really focuses on relations between people. And I think what happens when a person with an intellectual disability enters or tries to enter a mainstream service, a whole web of relations starts to operate. And that's between that person, between the staff in that mainstream service, these are the mainstream service staff, the carers, the support workers, or an informal carer, or a family member carer coming with that person. And then there's all these other service users with or without disabilities who use that service. So there's quite a few different actors involved. And the skills of the staff, both the mainstream service staff and the carers and support workers, their attitudes, these things and their practices, all of these shape experiences of inclusion or exclusion from the service. So just to give an example, in terms of attitudes, expectations is one of the things that comes up in the literature. So sometimes mainstream services staff, if they see a person with an intellectual disability, or usually it could be any disability actually, often the staff members wouldn't even know what kind of disability it is, and it wouldn't necessarily identify a disability as being an intellectual disability. They often confuse it with other types of disability. But what sometimes staff members tend to do is lower their expectations. They would think, well, in a sports activity, they would think, well, we don't have to do it very competitive because they have a disability, which, they do it probably for very, good meaning reasons. They want to make it more inclusive. And I'll talk about flexibility as one of the, I guess, the positive principles of inclusive services. But by lowering expectations, they also limit the opportunities that come for people that come with using a service. So if you make the sports activity less competitive, it might also be less satisfying. So those sorts of things, those skills and attitudes are the kinds of things that can shape experiences of inclusion and exclusion. And you could already see from this example that it's very nuanced. There's always a kind of balances to play. It's so complex and nuanced. What's the boundary between having too high expectations or too low expectations? It's not always clear cut. And those are the sorts of things we try to understand in our study. These are the sort of relational issues that are discussed in the literature, and other more structural issues are also discussed that shape the extent to which a service is inclusionary or exclusionary. These are things like the funding available to services. So often we talk about public services that are funded by government, and often they're not very well resourced. Think of a community center in a particular neighborhood. They don't have much funding from the local government. So they don't have a whole lot of resources available to train their staff, for example, to learn communication accessibility. I'll talk about what that means as part of my presentation, or to develop a diversity and inclusion plan. So they just don't have the resources. We are going through a digitization revolution. Leslie and I just had a chat about AI a few minutes ago. The world is getting increasingly digitized, and for people with intellectual disabilities, there's opportunities in that in terms of being able to access resources and to access services. But there's also challenges of navigating a kind of a more digital world. That's a kind of a more structural issue. I won't go into it in my presentation today, but it was certainly something that we've discovered in the study, and we published another paper on that. We live in a neoliberal world where many people have jobs that are insecure. And for services, for public services, that means that the staff turnover is very high. People stay and work in the service for a relatively short periods of time. The implication is that I guess the services have a challenge of training the staff members to have those skills. For example, communication, accessibility skills. You need to train staff, and if you train your staff and they leave a couple of months later, you have to train new staff. So that's all of that is quite expensive. And finally, I'll also say that many of the services we looked at did have like diversity and inclusion, equity, diversity and inclusion strategies. And those strategies do refer to disability as one of the groups they're quite explicitly trying to target and to be more inclusive of. But intellectual disability is often neglected, and there's rarely there's rarely an explicit mention of intellectual disability. And that is an issue, and you'll see when I go into kind of more detailed findings from our study that people with intellectual disabilities can have very different needs and preferences from people with other types of disability. So that's an overview of the knowledge from the literature. And as I said, what we were trying to do is get a little bit more of the nuance for some of those issues, but also try to find some of the principles that apply across different sectors and different types of services and develop a practice framework. So we conducted a study here in Australia. We went to a few different regions in Australia. We found 40 people with intellectual disability who agreed to be part of our study. And we did an interview with them and we asked them what mainstream services they use. And we found out where they go. Some of them say, we like to go to the public library here. Some of them say, we'd go to the neighborhood house or community center in our neighborhood to meet people, or they go to the local swimming pool, leisure center, all kinds of services they spoke about. So we wanted to hear from them which of those services they felt were inclusive, where they felt comfortable, where they enjoyed going to and felt that they were treated well. We asked them what made them feel included in those services and comfortable there. And then, with their permission, we went to those services that they have identified as more inclusive, and we spoke to staff members in those services. And we wanted to hear from those staff members what it is that they do to make their service more inclusive. So we learned about their practices. And as I said, we went to staff in services, a whole range of types of services. We didn't focus on any particular sector. It was anything from health, leisure, transport, community, all sorts of things. So that was the research side. But then there's also the applied side, which was, okay, we've identified findings, which I'll present to you today. And then we've developed a training resource. It's really a website with lots of different modules that we want to make available free for all mainstream services anywhere in the world, really, to use as a training resource for their staff. So all the principles that we've identified and which I'll present today, we want to teach them. We want to educate staff in mainstream services and make it easier for services to train their staff to be, to practice in more inclusive ways. So today is the informal launch of our of our resource. I haven't showed it. We haven't showed it to anyone outside our team yet. And you'll see, I'll present to you lots of videos, and these videos are part of that resource. And those videos include people with intellectual disabilities speaking about what it means to them to be included in a service. I think just for context, the study was done in Australia, And it's a really interesting time in Australia to do research on disability in general and inclusive services, because in the last 10 years, we've had a new national disability insurance scheme. So a massive national reform in the way that disability services are funded. Public funding for disability services doubled or even tripled thanks to this reform. The primary aim is to advance participants' full inclusion in the mainstream community. So obviously aligns very well with the, I guess, the aims of our research. This insurance scheme, the NDIS, also provides individualized funding. So all the funding for disability services is now individualized in Australia. So rather than funding services, the funding goes to individuals to give them more choice and control about how they use their funding. So the NDIS doesn't fund mainstream services. It funds individuals with disability to get support, and they can use that support to access mainstream services, if that makes sense. So I think that's just useful context to know why in Australia there's a lot of interest now in those questions around mainstream inclusion and a very unique policy context. I don't think any other country has followed such a radical transformation in shifting all the funding from what used to be block funding for services to individualized funding for individuals. Okay, so now we're reaching the fun part. This is the first video I'll show you from our resource. This is where we ask participants, what does inclusion mean to you? And we ask them specifically also to think about services that they use and what inclusive services mean to them. Hopefully this will go and work, fingers crossed.
Inclusion means is to get involved some activities and make sure getting introduced to new things and new skills.
There's a word called acknowledge.
It means like including you in or something. It's like you're having like a conversation, but they sometimes talk to people a bit differently.
What they say, let's say, getting to know you.
It's really not fair. Yeah, I hope we can have people can include disability more often.
Just being able to socialize with our own people our own age.
For example, like bowling alleys, cafes, restaurants.
Getting involved with different things may help my social skill. My nervous to talk to new people. It can actually may help stopping it from any bad things from happening.
Surrounded by people you know, which is like old friends, and making new friends, and including the staff.
So, yeah, you can hear what inclusion means for people with intellectual disability. That came from these participants in the videos that we recorded, but also all other participants in the study. Very similar ideas, all pretty straightforward, really. People want to feel included. That's what inclusion means. They want to make old friends, meet old friends, connect with new friends, and feel that they're part of something. So then we went and asked people, okay, what was it about the services that you do feel are inclusive? What is it about those services that made you feel included? And I'll talk about 6 different themes. I would argue these themes are the sorts of features or principles that we argue are the foundation of a practice framework for mainstream services. And the first one is respect. Participants they always started with that, and they always started to say that they felt included where staff in mainstream services and other service users treated them with respect. And there were three elements for that. One is dignity, just being treated as an equal human being, equal worth. That's what dignity means to me, I think. And the other was privacy. That's an element of respect, but it just came up quite a lot that participants said, I guess a lot of situations where privacy was not respected. And so that was an example of what it means not to be treated with respect. That was a huge issue for a lot of participants in lots of different services, feeling that their privacy was not being respected. And the third element is autonomy, where people felt that they were given choice and control about how they use the service. And the way that they spoke about it in very simple terms was that they felt that they were being listened to. They were asked what they want, and the staff in the services listened to them. For them, that meant respect. So let's see one more video.
In a cafe, they'll go, "Hello, what would you like?"
Listen to the one with the disability. Listen to what they have to say.
They would give me a piece of paper at the end of my stay at the cafe, and I get to write down what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it. And then they took that feedback and then they would show that they can improve their experiences with us, and then ask if they need assistance, like grabbing something off the shelf.
Just talk together and that's it, and listen.
That was a very clear message from participants. Respect, treat us with respect. That makes the service more inclusive. We spoke to staff members in those services, and they also acknowledged the work that they do to make this, I guess, to treat people in a more respectful way. But they've also highlighted the complexity. It's not simple in some situations, like autonomy and respecting service users' autonomy. No one questioned that that's what should happen, but they also highlighted, I guess, tensions. This was a really interesting example. It was a librarian we spoke to in Melbourne, and he said, I had a gentleman with an intellectual disability who wanted me to apply for one of those payday loans for him. So a payday loan is like a predatory loan. It's easy access to credit, but you pay very high interest and very high fees. It's quite exploitative. So he knew that person had an intellectual disability. He knew he wanted to that payday loan, and he was asked to fill in the form for that person. And he felt very uncomfortable to do that, because he felt the person doesn't understand the risk. Now, we have, in the world of disability studies and practice, we have a whole framework for supported decision making, which is all around those sorts of issues where there's decisions that need to be made. They involve high risk. You want to make sure the person with intellectual disabilities autonomy is respected, and that whatever decision they make is based on their own will and preferences. But you also want to make sure they are supported to understand the risks, to understand the decision that they're making and the different factors. It's not simple. And I mean, even disability support workers who are trained to work with people with intellectual disability are not trained on all the different principles of supported decision making, let alone all librarians who work with, I guess that's not a major part of their job. So how do we make sure that librarians and people in sports centers understand complex issues like supported decision making? The next theme, I spoke about respect and people wanting their autonomy respected. But the other thing was, and respect sounds quite, kind of cold maybe, or dry. I'm not quite sure what's the right term, but really what participants told us was that they want warm, friendly engagement. That meant inclusion for them too. So it's not just about respect. They just said in very simple terms, be friendly to us. And when they spoke about the services where they felt included, they spoke about usually staff members in those services treating them in a very warm and welcoming way. Let's hear what they were saying.
I had one really bus driver. He was really kind and smiled. Just say, come in, make it cheap. Come in, just go. Respectful is like when you go out and they all smile and that. At my gym, I had these lovely ladies. They say, hello, how are you? Good afternoon. I'd say, bye. That's it.
It's like he's like a let's just say friendly service.
It's just because they treat you nicely.
I would like staff in mainstream services to introduce themselves first off.
Let's say for example, I'm at cafe, which is it's really a guy there who knows me. It's like he knows what I want. He can do it with and without cash. It's like he knows me way too well.
So, yeah, it's about being friendly. It's very simple. But I think it's important to say that because we can get very easily tied up with things like, matters of privacy. It becomes very bureaucratic, for example, and you're trying to ensure that privacy is respected. But if you forget this kind of very interpersonal, welcoming human touch, then your service is not going to be inclusive. The next theme, and it's kind of related, it's still staying with this sort of relational, interpersonal thing, is that it's not just about the interactions between staff in the services and the person with an intellectual disability, it's also their interactions with all other service users who use that service. These are people with and without disabilities. So staff in the services have a responsibility to make sure, I guess, to mediate some of those relations. And part of that is making sure that everyone is safe and everyone is safe and free of violence and abuse. And that means also protecting service users with intellectual disabilities from other members of the community who can at times be quite abusive towards them. But also it goes in the other direction as well. And again, that raised all kinds of questions and dilemmas that service providers spoke to us. We heard from participants with intellectual disabilities about their experiences, sometimes even being removed from services. They didn't quite understand why they were being removed. But when we spoke to service providers, they told us that they removed a person with an intellectual disability because they were abusive towards other people like staff members or other service users. They were shouting, they were using some kind of threatening behavior. So it raised really complicated issues about how do you ensure everyone is safe and at the same time an inclusive approach where people are not just turned away and asked to leave, but are able to participate and stay. So that was one of the challenges we were trying to deal with when developing the training resources. What are the kind of messages that we need to give services about what to do when these sorts of complex situations arise? Another theme that came through is communication for people with intellectual disability. One of the challenges is often communication, and our participants said that they felt welcome and included in services where staff actively listen to them. So active listening. And I spoke about listening earlier in relation to autonomy in the sense of being listened to, in the sense of your autonomy being respected. Here I'm talking about listening again, but in a slightly different kind of nuance here. It's about literally people listening to them when they speak, because communication access, being able to communicate with other people, it's a skill, and there's some technical skills around communication, but really it is fundamentally about listening, about staff in the services just listening, being very attentive, being very proactive in their listening, and listening not just to what people say, not just the words they use, but all kinds of other non-verbal forms of communication. And taking the time. Communication accessibility is about taking time to let a person express themselves in their own unique way. Let's hear what our participants say about communication access, which is another feature and principle of inclusive services.
I've been to the bank and they haven't taken the time. They were rushing through. Calm down and speak calm and clearly of the information that you're giving to a person with an intellectual disability. Just having a calm perspective towards someone with an intellectual disability and not rushing is really important, because otherwise they can get the misunderstanding of what they're actually what you're actually saying to them.
The staff that can actually explain it. Seeing you have a hard time reading, they will try to make it easy ways to explain it.
And it's just having the support as well is beneficial, because people like us, we may not always have a support worker with us, so having someone to interpret the information would help as well. My bank, for example, I'd like them to have an easy read information of how to access like even the online banking, because navigating the online banking account can become a bit confusing.
So that sort of links to what I mentioned earlier about digitization of services also, that we're in an increasingly digitized world, services are increasingly digitized, and that has implications for people with intellectual disabilities. Sometimes it makes it easier to access services, other times it makes it harder. But you hear quite clear messages from those participants about what an accessible, communication accessible service is. Take the time to listen to us and have some explain things in an easy, simple way, and have easy read documents where possible. So it's pretty straightforward, those messages. It's just kind of making sure that services actually do follow them. The next feature, theme, and principle of inclusive services is proactive support or proactive assistance provided to people with disability who enter the service. There's a couple of different elements, or I guess temporal moments where this happens. One is when a person first enters the service, the staff there should take the initiative to offer assistance, not just wait to be asked, but to really proactively offer assistance. This needs to be done in a very, I think, tactful way, because, again, there's questions of respect and privacy. So I don't think it works when a staff member just jumps in and says, do you have a disability? Do you need help? That's not how it goes. It's really a lot more gentle than this. But we asked staff in mainstream services, how do you do it in a tactful way? And they just said, look, we ask anyone who comes in, we asked them, how can I help you today? Is there anything I can do for you? And it could be anything from dietary requirements to accessibility requirements. And you bring all of these together, there's nothing intimidating about it. But what's important is that staff take the initiative to offer assistance, that they are approachable, that people know where they can find staff members. It's things like having a desk with the sign information on it can be such a big difference for people who might not know who to ask, or having a tag on your clothes showing that you're a staff member. It can make it much easier for a person with an intellectual disability to know who they can ask for help and also to feel comfortable to do so. And the third element is following up. So after a person has used the service, we heard from participants, they were saying that they like it when staff were asking them after that if they got everything they needed. And that's another opportunity for them to say, no, actually, I didn't get what I needed. Can you help me again? So the follow-up is also really important. Yeah, so Olivia, one of our participants with intellectual disability, told us how her physiotherapist follows up, how she checks in with her to see that she's okay, and whether she needs sort of other forms of support. And the staff in a neighborhood house in a community center in Melbourne told us how they ask everyone who comes in, really, asking, do you have any requirements, active support or dietary requirements, anything? That's the way to proactively offer assistance rather than wait to be asked. The next principle is flexibility. And staff in inclusive services kind of interact with service users in a more flexible way. This is a really important principle of what makes services inclusive. One element of it is about rules. Services have rules, all kinds of rules. When the rules are very rigid, that can be quite exclusionary towards people with intellectual disability. An example could be libraries that have very strict rules about the return dates of books and charging fees, late penalties. That can be quite expensive. That is not inclusionary towards a person who might struggle to remember dates, or who is dependent on a support worker to take them to the library to return the book, and that support worker might not be available on a particular day. So some libraries we spoke to, for example, completely removed all fines. No more fines for late return of books, just to make their library more inclusive, not just for people with disabilities, but for many other people who stopped coming to libraries and stopped borrowing books because of the risk of a fine. If you're in a low income, that's quite a big risk. The other element of flexibility is adjusting the kind of assistance staff provide to people. So not just kind of assuming everyone needs the exact same support, but really adjusting it to individual needs and preferences and being very flexible about it. Yeah, this is just an example again of late. I think it's someone, it has to do with fees and late penalty fees for not paying membership. And the staff members said, look, we understand that some people, they might not, we won't apply the same hard and fast rules if someone has a disability. So it's a level of flexibility and not too rigid approach to enforcing their own rule as a way of being more inclusive. And this is the final feature and principle of inclusive services. And this is an interesting one. Whose responsibility is it? And I think there's a spectrum here. So in some services we spoke to, mainstream services, they didn't change anything about the way they operate, and they expected people to have their own support worker or informal care with them. And that the support worker or carer, it was their responsibility to make sure that that person could participate. For example, if we had it was a gym, there was a class, I can't remember what particular sports they were doing. But the instructor just ran the class as usual. They didn't change anything. They made no adjustments. And the responsibility for making sure the participant with an intellectual disability could be part of that group, it was the carer that came with her. So the carer had to explain everything to that participant so that she could be part of the activity. So that's one end of the spectrum where the responsibility falls entirely on the support workers or carers. On the other hand, we saw the exact opposite, the other extreme. A support worker dropping off a person with disability in a service and going away, leaving it entirely for the staff in that service. It's up to them to make sure that person can participate. So I guess our argument is that in inclusive services, the way it works is that it's neither of these extremes. Usually it's somewhere in the middle where there's shared responsibility, both the staff members in the service and any carer or support workers that are available. Not everyone has a support worker with them, but if they do, that they work together and they collaborate in a way that makes everyone's responsible to support a person to participate on that service. Yeah, that's just one example, just a quote, but we had quite a lot of those describing that kind of collaboration. It's pretty, it's kind of simple things, but in this case, I think there was 3 carers holding a person in the swimming pool, and the person there, I'm not sure he was the lifeguard, but he worked in the center, and he just said, well, he knew he could help them, so he just explained to them how they could work together. He showed them the noodles, those flotation devices, and they work together to make sure that person doesn't drown and enjoys their time in the swimming pool. So that's just a simple example of collaboration between mainstream service staff and carers. So this is it really. These are the principles that we've come up with: respecting dignity, autonomy, and privacy, creating a warm, welcoming, and safe environment, listening actively, accessible communication, proactive support, offering assistance and following up, being flexible about rules and about the level and type of support provided, and disability supporters and carers and mainstream service staff working together in partnership to ensure people are included and participate as equal. And this is the online resource we've designed. Each one of these modules discusses one of those principles that I've talked about today. They use the same videos that you've just seen today, but also we had some kind of more interactive videos. So for example, you can remember that story about the librarian who said, what do I do when someone comes and asks for help filling up a form for a payday loan, a kind of predatory loan? What would you do? So these interactive videos, you can actually role play the librarian, and you have to make choices about whether you're going to help that person or not. And those sort of situations help you think through the complexities and learn some practices and tips. So our next challenge is to get this resource out there to the world, to services, and make sure it's being used. And maybe I'll stop here and I'll stop sharing and I'll take some questions and open for discussion.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I'll open it up to the audience. Any questions? While people are figuring out unmuting and things, I do have a question.
Sure.
So, and I'm not quite sure how to ask it. I really like your work because it moves beyond the black and white of policy, that everything should be inclusive, to kind of the emotional piece of it, right? The principles that you're outlining are what each of us should do to help, even if we someone can physically get in the building, to welcome them into the building, into like the smiling and the respectfulness and things of that sort. So don't see that too much highlighted, and that was interesting. I know just like the librarian, my question was related to the how. I know people struggle with how to navigate that balance between accommodation and inclusion and how much, right? And many times people accommodate too much when it's not needed. And so do you think that having the modules done, that could be a way that that's used as a tool? I know several people struggle with that.
And yeah, thank you. This is a great question. I think this is spot on. This is finding those kind of balances. That's the real challenge. And as I said, it's a relational approach, and in relations, there isn't right and wrong. Like there's never just the right way of relating to other people. It's much more complicated than that. So I'm hoping that our modules will help people at least think through those concerns, like to even just to acknowledge that privacy is an issue, or that they actually have to listen to a person's will and preferences rather than assume. So those sorts of things, just to create awareness. But there are definitely complicated parts, like the library and the loan. What we're trying to do is to give, I would say, it's a sort of abbreviated version of supported decision making, which is a much more complicated framework used for people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities. We try to give a taste of it, just kind of an understanding of the principles and some small tips to help people apply those ideas, just the principles. But I think in the end, it does come down to the judgment that people make on the spot, and really navigating very complex situations. So
That's interesting. And many times people are afraid to do the wrong thing and then don't do anything as a result, right?
yeah. One of my dilemmas was we developed those, as I mentioned, those interactive resources where you choose an action and you see a situation, like you're the librarian, someone comes to you, and you see it in a video, someone comes to you and asks for help with the filling up the loan form. And then you ask, will you help them? One option, will you help them? Number two is turn them away because it's too risky. Number three, talk to them about it and see how they, how well they understand it. So it kind of helps them understand those decisions in a more experiential way.
Absolutely. Social psychology in practice for sure. So, Dr. Shi, do you want to, she had put some questions in there. I don't know if you want to unmute. Hello.
Yes, Dr. Wiesel. Thank you for sharing this very interesting research. If I understand correctly, your participants include people with disabilities and also the service staff, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I just wondered if you had gathered some data about the different perspectives on inclusiveness from these two different cohort of participants. And do you, by chance, just evaluate the overall satisfaction on the inclusiveness from the people with disabilities?
Yeah, thank you, Celia. It's a great question, and I think so. I should say that the study was qualitative, so we did evaluate, but in a qualitative way rather than kind of putting, I guess, I can't say 70% of the services were inclusive or not, but I guess we came up with, it was very obvious that people that we spoke to, our participants with intellectual disabilities, had many experiences of non-inclusiveness, of exclusion. So most of the time they spoke to us about quite unhappy things that happened to them in many services they used. And many of them were really isolated in the sense that they didn't even go out to visit services. They were, I guess, almost self-excluding because they had such bad experiences. So I think if the overall satisfaction with inclusiveness in society, I would say it wasn't a positive story. It was really a story about exclusion. But in this study, we did want to focus on those few places they went to, like the services where they did feel included. So there's kind of a bias towards the best practice. and with those services, we try to learn from them what they're doing well. But yeah, we did hear different perspectives from participants who have an intellectual disability and from the service providers. And there were some issues of debate, and there's also debate, I think, in policy and literature. For example, around, is it more inclusive to have, a person with intellectual disability integrated into a group of all other people in an activity? Or sometimes is it more useful to have a separate group for people with intellectual disabilities because they can get more targeted assistance? For example, a swimming class where they can really get kind of more targeted support. And we didn't get one single opinion. There were all kinds of different opinions from people with disabilities and without disabilities. So, yeah, lots of different perspectives.
Thank you for sharing. Great.
Thank you.
You know, there are some components when you were just describing that, when both of you were talking about that. One of the topics here in our state and then nationally is guardianship, right? And I
Yeah.
would imagine the same murky gray area in different perceptions and what's best and what am I doing versus how others are perceiving, perhaps is found in that decision-making process for guardianship and involving how much it involves the individual with the disability and then the ultimate decision. So, as you break down these inclusion, you start to break down, I'd be curious to see if you see in other decisions related to individuals with disabilities, if the process is.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, we have a whole other project that is all about, I guess, not guardianship, but supported decision-making, which, yeah, I mean, that's a whole other kind of worms in a way, because so much complexity. We had a royal commission, a sort of quite a significant process in Australia, 3 years, hundreds of people coming to give evidence before, I guess, a commission investigating all kinds of things related to disability, neglect, abuse, exploitation, and violence. And guardianship was a big part of the discussion. And we wrote a report about all, I guess, what we think was the approach to apply supported decision-making. Which wasn't a complete replacement of the Guardian system. We never recommended that, but I guess bringing the principles of support and decision-making into those systems of guardianship as well, and maybe a longer-term kind of development of a new system that replaces guardianship, but not immediately. But yeah, that is almost a completely separate project. But it is an interesting question of how you can bring those principles and those really complicated issues to a librarian who that's not his main job or her main job, and how can they learn to apply this in their everyday work?
Mm-hmm. No, fantastic. Maybe I'll follow up with you to get that report or to get the link to that other report.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Okay.
Happy to share.
Thank you. And I see people are needing to go, and it's 5 o'clock or 9 o'clock your time.
Yeah.
Let me put, the link to the evaluation is now in the chat. Please fill this out. We use this and it's very helpful to strengthen this series. And then for your time, everyone's time, just this discussion and listening to your work is really interesting. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for your time and for listening. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Take care.